I think we're going to begin because we have a lot to get through today and it's already 15:15. So if students are late, then they can catch up. And anyway, the first 5 minutes is just going to be me talking to you about very boring administrative stuff. Let's go to, of course. Right. Oh, inevitably, of course, the first thing I try and do doesn't work. Let's go back, shall we? Right, so to give you a brief introduction to me, basically, well, my name is Dr. James White. You can refer to me as Dr. White, if you would be so kind. Basically, in 2014, I graduated with my doctorate from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. I specialized in the history of the Russian Orthodox Church. Since then, I've taught briefly in the University of Passau, Germany, and in 2016, I got my main job, which is research fellow in the Ural Federal University in Yekaterinburg. And generally, I live in Russia most of the year, apart from the few months where I come to Tartu to teach this course. I've been a fellow part-time fellow at the University of Tartu for now about 2.5 years. So here you have my email. I generally have it on most of the time. So if you have questions or wish to make any comments, please feel free to email me at this address. Again, I hope you will have access to the Moodle. That's where all the readings are kept, where I've now uploaded updated information about the course. It's where you'll find the essay requirements and additional information. I've put up some maps, the Romanov family tree, etc., etc. That's all available on the Moodle. But again, just in case you need it to be confirmed, our course schedule is obviously Thursdays, 6:15 to 8 o'clock in the evening, and on Fridays, 10:15 in the morning till 12:15 in the afternoon. So about 3.75 hours in general every 2 weeks. Again, if you have problems, please check the schedule to make sure when we have our lectures, because we have 1 week on, 1 week off, then 1 week on. Later in the course, two of my colleagues here at the University of Tartu, Alison Kolosova, who's an expert on Russian missionary activities, particularly in the Volga region, will come and give a course, as will my colleague, Professor Elena Payet, who will come and teach to you about Orthodoxy in the Baltic region in the imperial period. So you have the lecture hall. I think you know what the lecture hall is because you are here. And of course, I have an office. It's upstairs, 309A. If you have a particular problem which you feel can only be dealt with via personal consultation, then please email me and we can arrange a time to meet in the office. I'm not in the office all the time. In fact, most of the time I'm currently working in the archive here in Tartu. So you do need to arrange ahead of time what you want to do, okay? That's more. So I'm very much aware that this is an English language course in front of, for an audience of non-native speakers. In fact, my entire teaching career in Germany, in Russia, and in Estonia has been spent teaching non-native speaking students. So generally speaking, I will try and make sure I'm as clear as possible, okay? I will generally try and not to use elaborate English idioms, slang words or phrases to try and make sure it's conveyed to you, make sure you receive the meaning loud and clear. If you do at any point have any difficulty understanding me, if I'm not speaking clearly, if I've not spoken slowly enough, if I use a phrase, a word that you don't understand, please put your hand up and we can stop and we can explain it, okay? Now on the Moodle, there's a glossary of terms. We're discussing religion, and there are some phrases which even native English speakers will not be familiar with. So please familiarize yourself with that, if you can. And I just want you to know, in this course, at the end of this course, and throughout this course, what I'm testing is not your English language skills. I'm interested in your knowledge of the subject we're going to be discussing. I'm interested in your ability to construct arguments. I'm not particularly interested in how well you speak English, okay? You're not being graded on that metric. This is not a language course, okay? Again, if you don't feel comfortable raising questions to me in the lecture, please email me and I hope we can resolve them, okay? So, the requirements. Please attend 60% of the lectures. If you do not attend 60% of the lectures, it's not a high bar, I think, but if you do not attend, I will not allow you to go to the exam and essay stage, and you will essentially fail the course, okay? I will take the registration every lecture so that I know how many people are attending. Then, presuming you meet that criteria, there will be an essay, which will be due on the 31st of May, I think, which is a Saturday this year. And we will also have an oral examination. I think the oral examination is easier for you than a written examination, which, you know, sort of an oral examination, I think it's easier to speak English than to have to write English in sort of intensive exam pressures. I will set the deadlines for the examinations later. I've already put some some suggested questions for your essays on the Moodle from last year. If you'd like to have a look at those, you're more than welcome. If you want to start your research, your work early, then feel free. I'll probably update the list to reflect the changes to the course from last year. But also, if you have a suggestion for a topic that you would like to write your essay on, you know, something that you're very interested in that's connected to the core subject, then please feel free to suggest that to me. We can discuss it, discuss your potential reading list, and hopefully we'll allow you to do this kind of research. And then there's the matter of the reading. So for those of you who already checked the reading, you'll already seen there's quite a substantial amount of reading, which I've already put online. I don't expect you to read everything that I put on the Moodle. It's an awful lot of literature. I try and offer you a range of choices. However, with each lecture, I will generally recommend that you read the pieces that I would like you to read, either for that lecture or for the next lecture. So, for instance, today, I've put some readings for the lecture today. If you have time, I would very much appreciate it if you read the articles by Fries and Dixon, which will provide you a general overview of Russian Orthodoxy in the imperial period from 1700 to 1917. And for tomorrow, I would greatly appreciate it if you could read the section in Hughes's book, which I put online, and also the article by Crummy, which is about religion in the 17th century. Yes. I've also put on some primary sources, documents translated into English exactly from the people living in this time. I will sometimes ask that you read these as well, because these will provide you a direct window into the lived experience of the individuals we are discussing within this course. Okay, I think that brings an end then to boring administration. Yes?
Question. Is this thing
yes, the cameras. I should have mentioned about you. Thank you. So the department has asked me if we could film this, because I believe this is their only, or one of their only courses in English, and they want to use it for online learning in the future. They're going to be here for every lecture. If you do have a problem, please email me, and we can discuss it, okay? Or rather, I will take your complaint and discuss it with the department head. Basically, they're filming me rather than you. But if there is a big problem, please just message me, okay? Right then. So on to the main body of today's lecture. Last year, when I gave this course here for the first time, I asked the students, how much Russian history are you taught in schools in Estonia? And I generally received the answer, very little. Is that the truth, I think? Good, then this is not going to be a waste of time. Basically, this course is going to be looking at the changing nature of the Orthodox religion in the Russian Empire between 1700 and 1917. This is a period of massive change. Between when Peter the Great declares the establishment of the Russian Empire in 1721 to when the revolution of February 1917 finally overthrows the Romanov Empire and establishes the Russian Republic, itself to be shortly overthrown by the Bolsheviks in October 1917. Russia undergoes radical changes on every conceivable stage: social, technological, political, geopolitical. Religion, including Orthodoxy, including the institution of the Orthodox Church, is not outside these changes. This course is about the changes that Orthodoxy, in particular, we will discuss some of the other faiths in the Russian Empire to a certain extent, but Orthodoxy in particular, undergoes between 1700 and 1917. It is not just about the changes that the Church and its bishops and its priests and its monks and its nuns undergoes. It is about the changes that religious behavior among the normal people undergoes, their religious activities, their religious conceptions, as technology, as links to the outer world become established. But I think, because so many of you do not have a sort of a grasp on the fundamental outlines of Russian history, it's a good idea to start with a contextual lecture, to look at how this change takes place. So we're going to have a look at the lives today of several peasants, live made up, but made up from general facts and characteristics, to see how life in Russia changed between the year 1800 and the year 1900. Now, I apologize if this lecture doesn't work precisely as it's meant to. This was previously 2 lectures which I've made into one, because we have a shorter course this year. So I hope I can compress it. I've managed to compress it successfully into 1 lecture. If you run a bit over, I apologize, okay? But we're going to start in 1800 with our first peasant hero, whom I've imaginatively named Ivanovich Ivanov. Ivanovich Ivanov is married. He has a wife, Nadezhda. Who are they? Well, they're peasants. And what is a peasant? Given a brief definition, it's an agricultural laborer. The lowest of the low on the Russian Empire's social hierarchy. Ivan is from Nizhny Novgorod province, located today about 2 hours by the Sapsan train from Moscow, 4 hours from Moscow by the Sapsan train, on the Volga River. He's quite young, probably the same age as most of you, about 20 years old. And so is Nadezhda, about 18. This is the average age of marriage. And as of yet, like corresponding conveniently to the national average, he has not had many children. Now, I'll just give you, I'm sure some of you aren't particularly familiar with the geography of Russia, so I will give you quickly. This is where Nizhny Novgorod province, this is the modern Nizhny Novgorod region today, approximately on the eastern side of central Russia. In fact, in case of Nizhny Novgorod, Ivan is a bit of an exception, because Nizhny Novgorod in about 1800 had quite a lot of handicrafts, less agricultural work, a lot of people producing, a lot of peasants who produce goods. He probably lives in the north of Nizhny Novgorod region, where agriculture was the predominant activity of the peasants. And here we can see a historical map of the province. So when I'm talking about where Ivan lives, he probably lives around about here. This is an area predominated by agricultural production. So, one of the major categories, the major facts of Ivan and Nadezhda's life is they are married. They are married they're quite young by today's standards, but certainly not young by the standards of Imperial Russia. In fact, the law allowed them to get married a lot younger, 13 for girls, 15 for men. But they fit in with the national average, more or less, 20 to 22. Marriage in the Russian Empire, as in most European societies at the time, is universal, or virtually universal. 90 to 95% of people are married by the time they enter their early 20s. But why is this? But why is this the case? Well, one reason, one brutal fact that makes early marriage a necessary strategy, if you like, is because people die young. Life expectancy is exceedingly low. 25 for women, 29 for men. But this is not the only reason why marriage is potentially attractive at a young age. It marked the passage into adulthood. Upon marriage, you established your own household, your own family. Upon marriage, you even adopted new ways of dressing, new ways of carrying your hair. Before marriage, women would cover their hair, for instance. After marriage, they could leave it uncovered. It was a stage of moving from the world of childhood into the world of adulthood. A more pragmatic reason: if you were married and young, well, you were less likely to be conscripted into the army, because the empire wanted you to make children. It didn't want to take fathers away from their wives and children. It was more interested in taking single men who had no other commitments within their communities. Married women had an enhanced social status in their communities. They were regarded as being mature, being more wise, and being more secure within family life. Women, on the contrary, who remained outside of marriage throughout the rest of their lives, tended to be regarded with a degree of social contempt. As we'd say in English, spinsters, people who couldn't get married. These are people who often tend to, because they lack a husband, are essentially jumping between one support network and the next, always on the margins of village life. Being a wife, but you had, at least in theory, a relatively secure existence and status within your community. And of course, if you were married, then that meant by the prescripts of the church and by generally upheld social mores, then you could have sex and ergo children. And indeed, you did want children. Just as life expectancy was very low, so child mortality was extremely high. As many as 1 in 4 of children born died in 1800, around 1800. Therefore, the more children you had, the more likely, the younger you started, the more children you had, the more likely you'd have children to survive. And you wanted some children. Children were useful. They just weren't sources of love. They were actually economically useful. By the time they're about 5, 6, 7, you can have them cleaning the house, making handicrafts. By the time they reach their early teenage years, they can be put into the fields to work. They're useful economic assets. And just remember, this is 1800 in rural Russia. There is nothing like we have today, like a pension scheme. You don't get to retire at age 65 and get a nice pension from the state. There's nothing. So what happens when you're too old, too sick, too broken to work anymore? Well, you need your children. They're the ones who are going to support you. So children, essentially, having a lot of children is essentially like a pension scheme. This, by the way, is not unique of Russia, or indeed even unique of this time period. This is generally something called the pre-modern demographic pattern. Pre-modern societies, rural societies, often produce a lot of children, precisely because children are economic assets and because children can look after you in your old age. Once industrialization starts, modernization starts, these patterns start to change. And indeed, we'll see that later in the lecture. So then, after their wedding, Nadezhda moves in with Ivan into his father's household. She leaves her parents' home and moves into the household of Ivan. Russia, peasant society, is tremendously patriarchal. The head of the household would be, in this case, Ivan's father. And Ivan's father has almost absolute power over those people within his household. On the contrary, Nadezhda, as the new young daughter-in-law, has almost no power in this thing. She is the lowest member of the household. These houses, by the way, you can see I've given you a sort of image here. Well, of course, there's variation between very rich peasant families and very poor peasant families. But often they contained about 8 to 10 people within a single room or a single space, sometimes 2 rooms. There is no conception of a notion of privacy in this space. No, privacy is a very modern conception. Here they have nothing. Everything that goes on is known to everybody. I include everything in that list, from the passing of waste to sexual relations to arguments. There is no conception of private living in these houses. By every conceivable modern definition, it is not hygienic. Because not only are people living crowded together in this tiny space, there are animals as well. Russian peasants often keep ducks, cows, chickens, sheep, perhaps if they're very rich, a horse, if they're very lucky. And many of these animals will live inside the homes. In the winter, this is also Russia, remember, it gets extremely cold in the winter. You need to keep the heat in, so you'll block any kind of gaps in the walls, the windows, etc., etc. So the stove, which produces the heat, will fill the house with smoke, making it difficult to breathe, difficult to see. 19th century Russian intellectuals who went to investigate the villages always noted how difficult it was to breathe in Russian peasant households. Oh, well, that's it. Oh. So that's an image, by the way, of a traditional Russian stove. You can still find them occasionally in sort of Russian summer houses. This was the kind of thing which was heating and lighting the houses. It was traditional to sleep on top of them because they were the main source of warmth in the house. So as I just mentioned, Nadezhda is the lowest of the low in her new household. She is going to be subordinated to the commands of her mother-in-law, her father-in-law. She is going to be given the dirtiest, most unpleasant jobs in the household, according to her status. Well, she might. And of course, because she is vulnerable both to Ivan is her husband, and therefore her social superior by law, And within the household, her father and mother-in-law wield absolute authority over them. And of course, domestic abuse is not a rare occurrence within these communities. And so you might suggest, well, can Nadezhda not, for instance, escape and get divorced? Well, divorce, but for all intents and purposes, is impossible. The Orthodox Church does permit divorce, but very, very rarely granted them, as I hope we'll discuss in a later lecture. Running away from the village was, for reasons we're about to discuss, illegal and extremely dangerous. Running into the rural countryside with barely paved, with virtually no roads, full of bandits, thieves, as a single woman in 1800 was an inherently dangerous prospect. So there is little Nadezhda can do about her new situation, other than to hope her father-in-law and her husband are relatively pleasant people. So, as I mentioned, Ivan and his wife are peasants, and they are predominantly occupied in their village with agricultural labor. This is the same as most peasants in the Russian Empire, who are generally occupied with bringing in crops from growing their own food in the fields and bringing them in when they've grown appropriately. In the empire, especially in the central regions of Russia, rye and oats are the most important forms of staple crop. There is no gender division in the labor. Both men and women work in the fields doing all kinds of agricultural work throughout the year. And it is precisely the agricultural calendar which predominates in the village. The most important time is the summer harvest. The holidays occur before and after the harvest. Celebrations, both within the church and without, in the hope of, firstly, to pray for a good harvest and to pray in thanks for receiving the harvest at the end of the period. This, by the way, is an economy with virtually no money circulating. The peasants will basically, they will take in enough product to feed themselves, to feed their families, enough product to give to the landowner, enough product to give to the state in taxation. There is virtually no money in Russian peasant society at this point. This is a society which deals in trade in kind. The goods which are traded is food, animals, handicrafts, but not money. Well, this was pretty much the case, by the way, for all of Europe in the year 1800, with possibly the exception of the Netherlands, northern Italy, and southern England. Most of Europe is an agricultural peasant society, be it in Russia, be it in northern England, be it in Germany, be it in Estonia. But Russia has some exceptional problems caused by its geography. For one thing, there wasn't enough good land. Well, you think, look at Russia, and the Russian Empire in particular, it's huge. How can there not be enough good land? Well, that was the case. Most of the good land was in Ukraine, or what we today would call Ukraine, the so-called black soil region. Much of the rest of Russia was, agriculturally speaking, very, very difficult. Siberia was, and still is to a great extent, a frozen wasteland and forests. The same is true for the Russian far north. A lot of the south is what we call steppe, steppe, which is dry grassland spreading for miles upon miles upon miles, where it's very difficult to grow anything but dry grass. The weather, the seasons are bad. The winters are long and exceptionally cold, colder the further north and the further east you go. The summers are short and very hot. And this, of course, is not facilitated by the absence of any sort of modern agricultural knowledge or implements. The only kind of fertilizer known at the time, well, at least in rural Russia, was manure, generally produced by animals, also by humans. The tools that the Russians used to farm were basically the same you could have seen 1,000 years earlier. Scythes, hoes, extremely traditional, extremely inefficient. As a consequence of all this, most Russian villages were only a bad year or two away from starvation. Let's say 1 year, you might be able to gather enough grain to keep some supplies. But if you have 2 years of bad weather, a winter that's too long, a summer that's too wet, then starvation could be a serious problem. And famines are indeed a regular occurrence in the Russian countryside. And of course, there was a lack of variety in the diet. Meat was a luxury by most standards. You got proteins from things like eggs, eggs, etc. But then, of course, compared to today, there was no fruit, most of which had to be imported. Diets are basically very, very regular, very unvaried, which of course causes health problems. Again, this is true throughout Europe of the period and Europe of the past, of the previous 1,000 years. We know today that people are much taller than they were in the year 1800, precisely because our diets are so much more varied. Because we precisely now, generally speaking, receive the nutrients we need, we're able to grow taller. Average height in Russia and elsewhere at this period was much lower because of generally spread malnutrition. And now we come to the predominant social organization of the Russian Empire at this point, 1800, serfdom. So what do I mean when I say a serf? A serf is a person who is permanently attached to a piece of land by law. And the person who owns that land, ergo, owns the serf. Okay? Now there's a distinction between serfdom and slavery, legally speaking. A slave is somebody who is without land, without any connection, who can be sort of bought and sold. A serf comes with the land they are attached to. Okay? It's a crucially important distinction. However, in the 17th century in Russia, there had been two different categories of people, serfs and slaves. But by the year 1800, the category of slave had become extinct, and the category of serf had become more or less the same as slave. This meant that the landowners could buy and sell serfs as they pleased. Ivan and Nadezhda, our two characters, are serfs. They are, for all intents and purposes, the property of the man or woman who owns the land they live on. Now, the Russian Empire generally, the Russian law code at this point, does forbid the absolute free sale of serfs. It generally tries to prevent, for instance, families being broken up. But we know this happened quite regularly. In fact, we know it happened quite openly. We have the newspapers, the provincial gazettes, which advertise serf markets, where peasants were bought and sold. And this is not just a small number of the population. 50% of all Russian peasants, 85% of the population are serfs. In effect, slaves. There were some other categories of peasants, state peasants, for instance. That meant the state technically was in charge of you. And that's the closest you got to sort of being a free peasant in sort of the year 1800. This system allowed for, of course, there's a picture from just after the abolition of serfdom, the sale of a serf girl. And this system allowed the landowner almost unlimited authority over his or her serfs. In 1800 in Russia, by the way, you could, as a noble woman, you could own land and you could own serfs. This is in distinction from some other areas in Europe. Virtually every aspect of your life could be dominated by the landowner. If you wanted to get married, then you had to ask the landowner's permission. In some cases, you had to pay the landowner for the privilege of being allowed to get married. Want to go somewhere else? Then you have to pay for your passport and permission to leave from the landowner for a certain allotted period of time. The landowner is the major figure of authority in rural Russia. They even had their own court systems, at least the richer ones do, to make sure to decide disputes between their peasants. If you decided that you didn't like your landowner, or that you didn't want to obey their rules, well then, the landowner could have you punished. And usually that punishment took the form of physical violence. Most commonly, you would be whipped, publicly. They could levy fines against you. And remember what I said about lacking money. And if you really did something bad, or you really managed to annoy the landowner, then they could say to the state, this person should be a conscript in the army. Or they can use a mechanism known as administrative exile to pack you off to Siberia, where you would not have, I can assure you, a pleasant time. Now, the state did try to have some measures enforced to protect serfs. It was aware of the gross power imbalance. For instance, you weren't supposed to kill your serfs, but you weren't supposed to kill them, you weren't supposed to sell them apart from their families. A few other measures, a few other regulations, but that was about it. The state had very little ability to intervene between the landowner and the peasants. Now, there were some extremely egregious cases. I've given you one here of Dalia Saltykova, an extremely notorious case that's gone down in sort of Russian history as one of the most greatest symbols of the abuse of serfdom. In the 1750s, she killed, not just killed, by the way, I'm saving you some of the details, tortured and killed 38 of her female serfs who worked for her on her estate. Another story. In the 1820s, one Russian nobleman wrote in his diary about an acquaintance of his. And this acquaintance was very much a fan of classical Greek and Roman sculpture. So he chose a very attractive male serf and a very attractive female serf and forced them to perform naked in his gardens as classical statues. Eventually, according to the diarist, these two serfs got so annoyed, so angry, so embittered with their owner that they smashed his head in with a nearby rock. Nobles had serf orchestras who they paid for extraordinary amounts of money to learn musical instruments. And some of these serf orchestras were extraordinarily renowned. The serf orchestras of Grigory Potyomkin, Catherine the Great's favorite statesman, performed at the imperial court. Some created acting troupes to perform the latest, most fashionable French play. Very, very rarely, a nobleman might even marry one of his female serfs. So that is the side of authority. And then we have obligation. Well, you see, you might belong to the land, but the land belonged to the landowner. And that meant he or she could charge you rent for living on that land. So not only were you essentially a slave, but you got to pay your master for the pleasure of being a slave. This kind of payment took three forms. Normally, it was done in produce, very rarely in money. Occasionally, there were richer serfs who might pay their masters in money. And then there was, perhaps the most common form, free labor, in which the serf, the landlord would say, very well, my serfs owe me 2, 3, 4 days of free unpaid labor a week, where they will work on my fields, on building my roads, on servicing my estate. In this case, I've said Ivan and Nadezhda, they're actually quite fortunate. Their landlord only requires 1 day. But there was no legal limit on how many days of free labor the landlord could require. Generally, the most that people have found is 3 days is the maximum, very rarely 4, if the landlord was particularly exploitative. Because, of course, the landlord they were themselves aware that the peasants had to work their own land in order to be able to pay dues, etc., etc. So they didn't want to take, it was mostly even in their self-interest not to take the peasants for too long away from their land, from their own activities. Okay. So then, what would your reaction be to this inherently unjust, indeed inherently cruel sort of social system? Well, there was escape. Many did run away. It was illegal to do so. Landowners and the state itself would post bounties on runaway serfs. Now, Russia is wide and vast, so there are many places to hide. Siberia in particular, or the far north, were very favorite locations of runaway serfs. But they were, if caught, firstly punished, having run away, and then returned to their landowner to do as they saw fit. There were some other means of escape. Especially the state itself realized the tremendous problems with this social system already at the beginning of the 19th century and started to try and buy peasants' lands from private owners and make them into state land, therefore transferring them into state peasants, which, as I mentioned before, is about as close as you got to being a free peasant in this period in Imperial Russian history. If you were a very successful peasant, let's say you learn a skill and you go to a town, you make a lot of money as a merchant or a businessman, then you could possibly try and negotiate with your landowner and buy your own freedom. In English, we call it manumission. But of course, the landowner would very much know that you are now a wealthy merchant making lots of money. And so, of course, the price for your freedom could be extremely high, perhaps far too high to afford. So essentially, serfdom is a system almost without any legal form of escape. And of course, this produces immense problems, namely rebellion. 793 peasant rebellions between 1800 in the 6 decades between 1800 and 1863. Some of these could be just as low scale as a riot or a minor fight. Others could be huge rebellions, the most notorious of which happened in the late 18th century, the Pugachev Rebellion, where the Cossack, soldier, and bandit Yemlan Pugachev rallied around himself serfs, Bashkirs, Cossacks, old believers, others who had been persecuted by the imperial state, and led a huge rebellion that destroyed vast swathes of the Russian east and south, until he was finally put down by an imperial army led by Catherine the Great's generals. Now this, of course, is one of the most extreme examples of peasant reactions to serfdom. But opposition and resistance were going on in everyday life. I mean, imagine, for instance, that I say to you now that, well, the law has dictated you all have to come and work in my coffee shop for free for a week. You can't leave, you'll get no pay, and if you do something wrong, then I have every right to beat you. Well, what kind of coffee are you going to make? How are you going to treat the customers? Not very well. And this is basically the peasant's attitude. We don't want to work for the masters. We're being forced to. And so their most common forms of opposition were things like working slowly, extremely slowly, working inefficiently, taking time off, casual acts of vandalism, hooliganism, etc. This kind of crime, if you want to define it as crime, is rife in the Russian countryside. Now, you might be asking yourselves, how can a state justify such a system as serfdom? How can it support it? Well, firstly, I want to, again, make this comparative dimension, is that Russia is not the only state that has serfdom. Certainly, a lot of European states have serfdom in 1800, particularly in Eastern Europe, places like Prussia, the Austrian Empire, although it's beginning to erode in the West, in places like France, in the Netherlands, etc. Well, the basic reason was serfdom was a mechanism of control. The Russian state in 1800 has no real forms of control in the countryside. There's no police force. There are no government agencies on every corner. There's virtually no government representation in the countryside. So how does the state control its huge population? Well, it relies on its elite, its social elite, the nobles, whom it rewards for their service with land. And those nobles are the people who keep order. They're the people who collect the taxes. They're the people who conscript people into the armies. They are the officers in the armies. They are the administrators in the very few bureaucratic offices that they are. These are the people whom the Russian Empire relies on. And it relies on, and it rewards them by giving them land. How can these nobles make land productive? They need free labor. In essence, serfdom is a way of ensuring that the nobility, who are the major means for controlling the Russian Empire, are rewarded for their service. This is the basic justification for serfdom, not just in Russia, but elsewhere in Europe. Serfdom is a way of providing for your military leaders, your administrative leaders, the people who bring order to the countryside. Now, already in 1800, there are people who are starting to criticize this. Most notoriously, Alexander Radishchev, the radical critic whose book, From Petersburg to Moscow, which he wrote in the early 1790s, was furiously critical of the condition of serfdom which he found most Russians in. It should be noted, and this is the picture of Radishchev here, that for his criticisms, he was initially imprisoned and sentenced to exile. He was later brought back, but the process of his experiences in prison and exile broke his mind, and he committed suicide in about I think it was 1802, 1803. But as I mentioned, there were some reformers around about 1800 in the government, people like Speransky, Alexander I had himself some knowledge, who were aware of the problems of the system. But how to change it? How to change it, that was the question. But so I've just introduced you to one form of authority in the peasants. In rural Russia, the nobleman, or the noblewoman. There is a second, one which is much dearer and nearer to the peasants themselves. And this is the peasant commune. It is basically a collection of the elders of the village who interact between the peasant community and the landowner and occasionally the state. So, for instance, they will deal with matters like apportioning land to each family. They will deal with matters of deciding when the state requires soldiers, who will be conscripted. When the nobleman decides that punishments are required, they're the ones who administer the punishments. These peasant communes are mostly dominated, and they are universally male, and they are dominated by the richest peasants of the community, the richest and the oldest peasants in the community. Now imagine some of these villages are quite small, and you know the elders in your commune. You have personal relationships with these elders. You might have personal difficulties. And indeed, it was not rare for them to use their power precisely to keep out people who they defied as troublemakers, the lazy, the sick, the otherwise different, and subject them to whatever form of punishments they had available, largely to clear them out of their communities. Just because they were dealing with fellow peasants didn't make them any more humane than their noble aristocratic owners. Now we discussed one, this is a form of punishment, but it was also a general fact of life. It was the army. The Russian Empire was almost consistently at war in the 18th century. And it needed men to feed this army, to feed these wars. Conscription calls were regular, and they would go forward to the peasant commune or to the landowner, who would then choose a number of peasants that they deemed suitable to go to the army. Of course, the peasant communes, if offered the chance, weren't going to select healthy young fathers like Ivan to go into the army. They were going to select troublemakers, alcoholics, single people, people whom the community could lose without suffering too much. And once you went into the army, chances are you were not going to come out. Because the minimum, once you were assigned, you had to spend a minimum of 20 years in the army. It was long noted in this period that the ceremonies that Russian peasants performed when one of their male relatives was sent to the army was like a funeral service. And that's because it was. Even if they survived 20 years in the army, which is by no means guaranteed, when they returned to the village, and remember how low life expectancy is, it's likely everybody they knew in the village would be dead. These people were essentially being shipped off forever. And as I mentioned, fatality rates in the army are quite high. Firstly, you could die in battle itself, and battles were notoriously bloody. I've given you here the example of the Battle of Borodino, one of the culminating battles of the Napoleonic invasion of Russia. 28%, more than a quarter of the Russian army die in the Battle of Borodino. Well, but death in battle wasn't even the major reason of fatality in warfare in this period. It's lack of food, it's disease, it's injury. And then, if you survive these things, well, discipline is harsh. You're expected to lead a regimented, regulated life, dictated by the code book of military behavior. And even the smallest infraction of what was deemed proper behavior could result in severe punishment. Notorious in the Russian army was a punishment they borrowed from the Germans, or Prussians, yes, the Germans, in this period, running the gauntlet, where the offender would have to run down, there would be 2 lines of men. The offender would have run through the center, and each man in the 2 lines would hit them with a whip and do it repeatedly over and over again until the commander was satisfied that justice had been served. The army is indeed a punishment, a severe one, which both the landowner and the peasant commune command. Then there was exile. Depending on which period, you could sometimes exile was to the Caucasus, particularly after the 1860s. But mostly this was exile to Siberia. And there were 2 types, administrative and criminal. Criminal is what it sounds like. You committed a crime, let's say murder, and then you were found guilty and you were sent to Siberia. And you would be marked and branded as a criminal. And literally, your head would be shaved. In the 18th century, you would have a brand, a burning metal mark placed on your face, and your nostrils would be slit to identify you precisely. And of course, you would always have to wear chains. And then you would be marched thousands upon thousands of kilometers into Siberia. There was this other category, administrative exile. And there wasn't a need for a legal process or a crime. The peasant commune, the state, or the nobleman could simply say, well, I'm tired of looking at you. Off to Siberia. That is what basically administrative exile was. And peasant communes possessed this punishment, this potential form of punishment. Now for the Russian state, how it perceives this idea is it thinks, especially in the 19th century, it thinks, we're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. We clear central Russia of all the criminals, all the troublemakers, and they go to Siberia. But there's barely any people at all, especially very few Russians. And when they're in Siberia, they can be our colonists. They can build Siberia up. Well, it doesn't really work out that way. Firstly, when you've marched people thousands and thousands of miles with inadequate food, inadequate shelter, through horrendous weather, they're generally not the best laborers. Most people are broken by the trip alone. And then these prisoners, these former prisoners, become a burden on the voluntary Russian settler population who already live in Siberia. They have to support them, provide them with food. Because these people when they arrive in Siberia, they don't turn into suddenly productive colonists in this region with wonderful farms. No, they are reliant. They either become reliant on pre-established colonial societies, or they become bandits and spread crime through the region. So exile as a strategy generally backfires on the empire. But anyway, this is again a form of punishment. This is the Polish painter Alexander Sokołowski's famous piece, Farewell to Europe. And what it shows is Polish rebels being marched beyond the famous boundary posts just outside the city where I live, in fact, Yekaterinburg, being marched from Europe into Siberia. And you can see, for instance, the shaved heads, precisely to note them, to demark them as political criminals. Now let's move away from, we're talking a lot about authority there, let's move to another element of everyday life among the peasantry: health and medicine. So let's say Ivan or his wife Nadezhda get sick. What do? Well, there are very, very, very few doctors in provincial Russia. Maybe there might be a couple in Nizhny Novgorod, the city itself. But to be honest, Ivan and Nadezhda would be better off not going to them. These doctors were educated in Hippocratic medicine, a theory of medicine that had held sway in Europe for thousands upon thousands of years. This is the theory of the so-called four humours, which argued that the human entity was made up of four different liquids, each one corresponding to the four elements that made up the earth, and that disease was a result of imbalance between these four different liquids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. So, for instance, if you were suffering from the flu or a cold or something that made you hot, then they would say, oh, you have too much yellow bile or too much blood. Therefore, we have to reduce those. Now, I don't know a lot about modern medicine, but I know that if someone is ill, generally the worst thing to do is to release blood. So this is not, generally speaking, an accurate form or a good form of medical treatment. And the other kind of medical professionals available in cities weren't much better either. They were the surgeons. And surgeons aren't the highly trained specialists we have today. They were people who were good at chopping off legs and arms in the quickest, most efficient manner possible. They were butchers. In fact, in Britain, surgeons had two jobs. They were hairdressers and they were surgeons. So there's not much in the way of professional medical assistance for Ivan or Nadezhda if they get sick. Now, in their village communities, there are some alternatives. Alcohol. By the way, just as a matter of point, when we have statistics for Russian alcohol consumption in the later 19th century, Russians actually scored middle of the field. They drank less on average than Frenchmen or Norwegians by the end of the 19th century, for instance. So stereotypes that Russians are perpetually drunk on vodka and so on and so forth can be discounted. But alcohol does, of course, serve a purpose. Now today, so imagine, there's nothing really in the way of medicine, nothing really in the way of treatment for even the smallest, the most banal, the most common sources of pain. For many people in this period, not just peasants, but even for most people, living means living everyday life carries an incessant amount of low-level pain for the majority of people. And there's very little you can do about this. You can use alcohol, of course. Alcohol is both a social liquid, a social substance to celebrate events, to ease contacts, to celebrate business deals. But it's also a way of quelling this kind of consistent and constant pain that one might feel. Now, in most villages, there was another option. Not a professional doctor, a wise healer, a folk healer, a village healer. Generally, as the 19th century went on, generally women, but also men were known to take on these roles. They were people on the edge of the village community, both physically and metaphorically, often quite old, often single. Now, visiting one of these people could actually, in some ways, be far more beneficial than visiting one of the professional doctors, very few there were in the cities, because these individuals knew about plants through long accumulated folk knowledge. And it is indeed true that some of the plants you can find in Russia, as in Estonia and elsewhere, common plants do contain things like sedative qualities, etc., etc. So they could be potentially a useful source for quelling pain or dealing with other illnesses. But being a folk healer was an inherently dangerous position. You were someone who was, your abilities, your knowledge came from precisely the fact that you lived on the boundaries of the village. But if something went wrong, if someone decided that you had done something to make them ill, then accusations would shortly be forthcoming that you were a witch or a wizard. And in many instances, this could lead to result in mob violence. And this brings me on to the notion of magic. Now, we're going to discuss this at a great length, and I probably need to move along quickly. For the Russian peasantry, the world is an inherently magical one. It is filled with various forces, some of them dark, antithetic to humanity, some of them light, sympathetic to humanity. Human beings could make use of these forces through rituals, through various different ceremonies, through holding certain items. They could command them one way or the other. Witches and wizards were people who could command these evil forces through ritual, through products. People like the priest, or holy people, were the ones who could command forces of light in this world. Combats the darkness. Now, the reason for this, of course, is simply, I've just described this world. It's a world full of darkness, full of pain, full of suffering, in a world where you have very little control over your life. Defining the forces around you as being subject to control, subject to magic, allowed you to reestablish your agency as an individual. The river might be a threatening source of death if you fell in. But if you cross yourself when going over the river, then you gave yourself the sense that you had done your best to prevent the bad thing from happening, preventing the misfortune from happening. You restored your agency, your power in a world full of misfortune, full of random chance, full of danger, death, and disease. I've given you a few examples here, but yes, this is ideas of witchcraft. We're going to discuss this in a later lecture precisely on peasant beliefs, but this, here are some just brief examples. Even among elites in the 18th century, beliefs in witchcraft were quite widespread. Demonic possession cases were recorded in the early 20th century among peasants. So as I mentioned, the church is a source of the good forces in the world for peasants. The way of driving away misfortunes, dark spirits, crossing yourself, carrying holy water, carrying a bit of the sacrament bread, reading a prayer, if you could read, or reciting a prayer rather, carrying a bit of paper with a prayer written on it, having icons in your house, icons being the pictures of the saints, the Virgin, Mary, Christ, etc. Praying, calling to the saints. These were potential ways to protect yourself, secure your family, and secure your community in this otherwise random and hostile world. And beyond, not just that, let's imagine what a Russian peasant village looked like. A sort of collection of wooden huts, in most cases, surrounded in mud, churned up by the rain. And then you go to the church, a holy site, decorated by the community, filled with candles, with singing, with jewelry and silver. with the words, the priest. The church brings the sacred into a mundane and normal world. What about the priest? Very briefly. Well, because we're going to have a very long 2-hour discussion about priests later in the lecture course. I hope you're looking forward to it. So the priests were, generally speaking, in 1800, they were literate. They went to the seminaries. They were obliged to go to the seminaries. They had to get a certificate from the seminaries to become a priest. They were male, exclusively so. And, importantly, for reasons we're going to discuss throughout this lecture course, they were the main point of contact with the state for most peasants. Most peasants, if they were conscripted in the army, they were conscripted by the commune or by the landlord. They didn't meet the army recruiting sergeant. They paid their taxes through the commune and through the landlord. They didn't meet the tax officer. They didn't meet the bureaucrats in the local office. Ivan's never been to the provincial governor's board in Nizhny Novgorod. But he knows the priest, and the priest is a government agent. The priest reads, on Sundays, will read the imperial edicts sent by the central state. He will read declarations of war and declarations of peace. He will perform the prayers for the emperor's birthday and the prayers for the emperor's death. Poverty, richness, etc. we'll discuss later. But we have to think, and when we think of these priests, by the way, in this period, 1800 precisely, these priests aren't the priests we think of today, how you think of our priest. They're not teachers. They don't really consider themselves to be teachers, and they're not required to teach. The peasants themselves aren't particularly interested in teaching. These people are performers of rituals. That is their major role. To perform the liturgy, to perform the sacraments, and to do it well and to do it accurately. This does change throughout the century, however. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with this image. At least I pray to God that you are. Now, we today, of course, will know this is a map of the world. Ivan and Nadezhda, of course, have no conception of this. There's no school building in their village. There probably won't be a school building for another century in their village. And even if there was, they probably wouldn't have maps or globes because these were elite possessions. Now they do know, so they have no concept of the world. They hear in the imperial edicts the priest reads out, or the sermons, which mention places like Jerusalem, etc., and Bethlehem, etc. They know there are other places. They know there's a Moscow and there's St. Petersburg. What those places look like, they haven't a clue. Sometimes we find some sources which indicate geographical knowledge. For instance, in my university in Russia, in Yekaterinburg, we have a source written by a peasant in the 1740s, which lists cities from England to China. So they did have some kind of idea, although when he painted the cities, the author always painted them as Russian cities, so they had onion domes, etc., etc. So there's basically no conception of the world beyond. Your world, as Ivan and Nadezhda's world, is basically limited to their village, the few villages around them, maybe the local market town, if there is one. People did not travel. Mobility was limited. We've mentioned serfdom is one major reason. Bad infrastructure is another. But things in Ivan's life, I think, are about to change. So let's say, for argument's sake, that Ivan is a successful... he and his wife make very good horseshoes, for instance. They're very good. They make very good horseshoes. And Ivan decides that he would like to go to Nizhny Novgorod, to the marketplaces in the city, to sell them. And he receives permission from his noble landlord, his owner, to go and sell these goods. And so he sets out on a trip which today would probably take about 1 or 2 hours by car, but for Ivan, over roads which are essentially non-existent mud tracks, takes him about 2 or 3 days. He goes to the city of Nizhny Novgorod. Nizhny Novgorod is a major trading hub. It's located on the Volga River. It's just south of Moscow. Goods are flowing upwards and downwards consistently in 1800. And when Ivan arrives in the city, he's introduced to an entirely different world. This isn't the village world of a wide street with with houses with big gardens, animals around, fields. This is a town of narrow, muddy streets covered in the waste of humans and animals. The smell of human and animal waste. Wooden houses that seem on the point of collapse shade the streets. In the center are the marvelous stone Kremlin, built in the 14th century, the governor's palace. Nighttime is a particularly dangerous time. There's no light. There's no electric light. Of course, there's no electricity. And the city of Nizhny Novgorod at this time did not provide street candlelight. So already when it goes dark, and if you know in Russian wintertime it goes dark about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's a dangerous, new, exciting space for Ivan. And as he goes to the market, and Nizhny Novgorod already has an internationally famous market in 1800, with traders coming from all over the world, he starts to have another new sensation, another new experience. He hears different languages all around him. Sure, Russian, possibly German, French, and maybe even English. Estonian, there was an Estonian community later in the century around Nizhny Novgorod. He also starts to hear even more exotic sounds. The sounds of Tartar, the sounds of Azerbaijani, Armenian, Georgian, Finnish, Polish, Romanian, maybe Bulgarian, Greek, from all these people gathering in Nizhny Novgorod at the Great Fair to sell their products. For the first time, Ivan is confronting the imperial dimension of the Russian Empire. Because Russia was a tremendous empire. In the 16th century, the empire marched east, conquering the Muslim khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, and finally, and most fundamentally, Siberia. The Cossack bandit leader Yermak conquers Siberia, and Russian forces push east and east and east and east until they either meet the Pacific Ocean or the Qing Chinese Empire. Russia basically, I should mention, this was not, by the way, this conquest had very much the same consequences for the Siberian natives that Christopher Columbus's conquest of the Americas had for the Native Americans. Disease and death on a massive scale. Somewhere around 85% of Siberian native tribes died off in the Russian invasion and conquest of Siberia. And it goes, yes, there's a map for your notes later. I will simply show it to you for a few minutes, but you can look. By the way, all slideshows go on the Moodle after I'm done, so you can look these up later. And then there was the Russian Empire marched west and south. Ukraine, or what was then known as Little Russia, now is known as Ukraine, was a satellite state by the end of the 17th century. The Great Northern War, more of which tomorrow, Russia conquers the modern Baltic states, Estonia and Latvia. Between the 1770s and 1790s, Russia together with the Prussian and Austro-Hungarian empires, divides up the Polish-Lithuanian state. Once a great and formidable power, now divided between three states, not to receive independence again until 1918. Crimea, of course today a source of problems, as I'm sure we're all aware, conquered in 1783 from the Muslim Tartar Khanate that had ruled it since Genghis Khan's invasions of the Russian steppe. And then finally, with Russia's successful emergence from the Napoleonic Wars, it gained Finland, Romania, Georgia, and Armenia. And almost soon after this victory, launched a decades-long war to subjugate the peoples of the Caucasus, the Chechens, Dagestanis, etc., etc. This level of geopolitical success, of course, brought with it significant problems for the state. How on earth do you manage an empire this big in 1800? You don't have telephones, you don't have internet, you don't have cars, you don't have planes. You have mud tracks and horses, and maybe in the winter you have sleds. 9,000 kilometers apart from Warsaw to the Pacific coast. 4,000 from Murmansk in the north to Tbilisi in the south. Hundreds of languages, tens of religions. Buddhism, Catholicism, Lutheranism, Orthodoxy, Armenian Gregorianism, Judaism. And there is no communication system, there's no transport system. If you want to send a letter from St. Petersburg to Irkutsk, it's going to take about 6 months to get there. And 6 months back for a reply. If you live near a river like the Volga on Nizhny Novgorod, that was fortunate. You could go relatively easy up and down the rivers. But Russia only has a few rivers that go north, or that virtually all go north to south or south to north. It has very few rivers, but no, it has no rivers, I beg your pardon, that go east to west. Managing this empire is a real problem. What do you do? How do you manage it? Ah, yes, I wanted to just briefly show you this before I forget. This is actually the trip by the novelist Ivan Goncharov, who went to visit Japan in the 1850s. And the reason he went from St. Petersburg all the way around to Japan, rather than across Siberia, it was quicker to go by boat around Africa. Siberia was that long and treacherous to travel through. That was the trip Goncharov, not only Goncharov made, but a lot of imperial administration made when they were sending letters and goods from St. Petersburg to the very far eastern parts of the Russian Empire. So how do you manage this? Well, you can try and occupy it with your army. But even the Russian army wasn't big enough to station everywhere permanently on military alert. And it's very expensive to do that. You have to pay for food, ammunition, sold fortresses, etc., etc., etc. It's quite difficult, expensive. So the Russian Empire turned towards the peoples it had conquered. It said, we'll offer you a deal. You be loyal to us, you give us what we want and need. We want taxes, we want conscripts for the army at some point. We want your loyalty. We want you to remain stable. And you, in return, we will say, you can have administration in your own language. You can have your religion. Your elites, your nobles will keep their powers. Maybe we'll even integrate those nobles into our own social structure. Generally speaking, then, this is an empire where difference is institutionalized as a system of government. This is going to change later, of course, when Russian nationalism in the late 19th century starts to become a force. And it's not always consistently obeyed, even at this point. This is generally how the Russian Empire keeps itself together. When we talk about the Russian Empire, we think of a huge single entity. Actually, it was more like a series of small local deals with different groups. Let's have a local example, shall we? 1721, the Baltic states come into the Russian Empire, and Peter the Great makes a deal with the German landlords who control the Baltic states in those periods. He says, precisely, you can have your Lutheran religion, you can have your social privileges as German landlords, you can have your control of the courts, you can have your German noble administration through administrative bodies. But basically you have to be loyal to the empire, serve the empire's interests, provide the taxation that the empire requires, provide the recruits that the empire requires. Well, in case you didn't know what it looked like, there it is. There is a map of the Russian Empire. Now, so let's leave Ivan for a second. Ivan sells one of his horseshoes. The horse rides north with its rider to the imperial capital, St. Petersburg. And I have to reinforce this in case you haven't missed this. Throughout the entire period we're discussing, St. Petersburg is the capital, not Moscow. Peter the Great, at the very beginning of this period, declares that Moscow is no longer the capital, St. Petersburg is. That remains the case until Lenin in 1918 moves the capital back to Moscow. Already in 1703, Peter had founded the city on what was essentially a rather rough-hewn Swedish fort that he captured during the Great Northern War. And he quickly tried to develop it by forcibly moving in nobles and merchants, by quickly establishing laws that demanded only stone buildings. And so by the year 1800, it was an extremely impressive European capital with its own art galleries, scientific institutions, government riddled with government agencies. This is the center of government, the center of court life, the center of cultural life in the Russian Empire. Here we have the Winter Palace, today the Hermitage, the place where the emperor lived, already the hub of imperial power. And here one would generally find the very elite of the elite, the cream of the cream, the leading Russian aristocrats. Now we've discussed these class when we discussed the landowners. But we should recognize that they were themselves differentiated, largely by the size of wealth. Very few landowners, aristocrats, beg your pardon, were ultra rich. 59, as we've got the statistic here, 1777, 59% of nobles own less than 20 serfs each. So most of them are quite poor, generally speaking. And where they would earn their money, they would earn it in the service of the state. They earned it by either being administrators for the central government, for the provincial government, or, and as the state generally preferred, they would enter the army and be its officers. Of course, being at the top means you have a very, very long way to fall if things go wrong. And the court is not a relaxed place. The imperial court in St. Petersburg is a world of intrigue, vice, and struggle for political power. You are required to follow strict laws and rules of etiquette, failure to observe which could bring shame on you and your family. And if you were engaged in this shadow game for power, then you could suffer extreme, and you lost. Then the consequences could be extreme. Here I've given you the example in 1742, and this is the picture of Natalia Lopukhina and Anna Bestugieva, who plotted against Empress Elizabeth some 60 years before our main narrative takes place. They were discovered and they were severely punished. They were punished by having their tongues publicly torn out, then chained and sent to Siberia. Ivan, the young boy, the 6-month-old baby, Ivan VI, when Elizabeth successfully overthrew his mother's regime, was imprisoned in a fortress for the rest of his life until about the age of 25, when finally Catherine the Great ordered him killed because she was worried that he was about to break out. It was not easy, in other words, to be at the top. And indeed, it was especially not easy to be at the very top. So in 1800, when Ivan and Nadezhda are alive, there is the one emperor, the Tsar, Paul I. Indeed, Paul the only. There was only one Paul. And his ruling ideology was this: I am the anointed of God, the chosen of God, and no man has the right to restrict my authority. Like God rules over mankind, I rule over Russia. Like man has no right to put limits on God, Russians have no right to put limits on my power. That's the theory. And there is no constitution. There is no Supreme Court, no parliament that restricts Paul's power. He's not elected. He's the oldest son of Catherine the Great. And the next ruler will be his oldest brother. It's a dynasty. But it's a theory. It's a nice theory. We probably got Paul some comfort, but only a theory nonetheless. In reality, he is reliant on his social elites, particularly the officers in his army. These are the people who control the country in his name, as we've already discussed through the idea of serfdom. This is a system that exists to support that extremely important administrative military class. And if you annoyed the army and the nobles, and in particular the nobles who are in the army, then the consequences could be dire. His father, Peter III, had found this out. Peter III decided to end his war against Prussia when Russia was winning early, because Peter III adored Frederick the Great. So he declared peace with Frederick. This annoyed considerably the Russian nobility, who decided to conspire with his wife, Catherine, and they overthrew him. Peter was thrown in prison by Catherine, and then a year later murdered by Catherine's lover. Well, one would have hoped that Paul might have learnt the sad lesson of his father, but regrettably not. Because Paul once again decided to engage on rather strange foreign policy adventures. In particular, he wanted to declare peace with the French and war on the English, something that the Russian aristocracy was dead set against. And so in 1801, a group of noble army officers, blessed by Paul's younger brother Alexander, broke into his apartments in his estate in Gatchina and proceeded to stuff a pillow over his face while he slept. Thus ended Paul, Emperor of Russia. Now, I realize I've gone drastically over time, so I might have to continue this tomorrow. I think we'll just start today with 10 minutes, and then we'll... So then, that was Russia in a nutshell in 1800. Now we're going forward a century, 1900. The picture, by the way, is from about 1911. This is a photograph taken by Sergei Gorsky, if I remember rightly, Prokhudin Gorsky, who went around the Russian Empire in 1910, 1911, taking photographs. And recently, colour has been restored in a very wonderful project. I will use his photographs throughout this lecture. What changes then have happened? Well, again, we'll start with an ancestor of our first Ivan, also named Ivanovich Ivanov. And again, we find the same things. He's a peasant. He's about 18. He recently got married to Anastasia, who's 16, and they already have a child. Note again, it's a bit younger now, and already they're producing children. And again, they live in this rather small, poor agriculture village in Nizhny Novgorod, the same village from which their ancestor had left to sell horseshoes a century earlier. And indeed, little seems to have changed. Houses are still these small peasant izba, these 1 or 2 room places collecting a large group. Everyone still works in the fields in the village, almost everybody. The same customs, holidays, belief systems exist. And life is still extremely dangerous for the people living it. An example, that famine was far from gone on the cusp of this modern era, came in 1891, 1892. A devastating famine went through central Russia, wiping out food crops and food supplies. The government, hindered by lethargic bureaucracy and its commitment to ship grain abroad, was slow to react, with the result that anywhere between 375,000 and 500,000 people died in this famine. So clearly, the sort of bare level, sustenance level existence of peasants hasn't changed much in the century that we've just passed over. Nor has life expectancy particularly. Women's has gone up, quite notably, from 25 to 33, but men's still only last about 30, 31 years. Still, it's about 1 in 4 babies dying in the villages. It's a slight improvement, but not by much. Still, these places are unhygienic, removed from any real medical support. But of course, that is the difference now in 1900, because you do have medical support available. Medical knowledge has been revolutionized in the century. We now have things like sterilization, anesthetic, proper pharmaceutical painkillers, etc., etc., etc. Okay, there's still very few doctors in Russia, but at least the doctors that are there now are properly trained ones who can assist you, potentially, with both major and minor illnesses, ailments, and diseases. By the way, if any of you know the Russian author Mikhail Bulgakov, the author of Master and Margarita, his first book is the Notes of the Country Doctor. He was a doctor himself before he became a writer and went into the Russian countryside about 1915, 1916. And he relates the experiences of what being a sort of a doctor was like in a peasant community at about this time. I'd strongly recommend if you had the opportunity to read it. But anyway, this still means, of course, the absence of doctors still means things like folk remedies, folk healers are still rather popular in Russia. What is the major change then? Well, finally, in 1861, Alexander II abolishes serfdom. Moved largely, it has to be said, to his credit by moral arguments, but also by economic ones, that Russia needed a free labor force in order to modernize. And it was greeted by most social branches, by the peasants, by various political ideologies, with celebrations. Nonetheless, however, there were problems about how Alexander rolled out this form. Alexander himself was a compromiser, trying to find a route between the sort of between his nobles, between supporting the noble class and liberating the peasantry. And so the reform was inherently problematic. One reason was because when it came time to decide who got what land, well, the commissions that decided that process were run by nobles. And unsurprisingly, they gave themselves the rather good quality land and left the less productive land to the peasants. Another problem was this new freedom wasn't, ironically, free. Alexander, the government, bought the land from the nobles, thereby liberating the peasants. Bought the land from the nobles and then gave that land to the peasants to support themselves. And then demanded that the peasants pay back that money. It was estimated that it was going to take about 60 years for them to pay back the sum the state had spent. And the state, by the way, charged the peasants above the market value of the land. This is a major cause of discontent in the countryside, running up into 1905, the revolution that took place there. And the peasants weren't really integrated into the Russian social or political body. They were still subject to the peasant commune. They weren't made like almost all the other citizens in Russia, subject to court systems, subject to provincial bodies, to government bureaucratic offices, to tax bodies. They were still subordinate to the peasant commune. And they still dealt with the state through the peasant commune. And it was still the peasant commune that assigned things like punishments, rather than the new court system or the bureaucracy. They were still a segmented, distinguished, and limited group in the population. But it brought many new freedoms as well. So you no longer had to carry a passport. So I beg your pardon, of course you did. You no longer had to ask the landowner for permission to marry, for a passport, permission to travel, etc., etc. You no longer had to do work for him. You no longer had to pay the landowner tax, etc., etc. Your tax now went just directly to the peasant commune. You can no longer, after the abolition of serfdom, be physically punished. You're freed from the fear of fists and the whip. And as a consequence, the noble lands in the countryside decline, and peasant lands begin to expand. No longer limited by the by noble control of the land, peasants start buying up land, and they consequently begin to have more and more children. The problem is that as people have bigger and bigger families, there's less and less land to support them, especially since most of the peasant lands being sold are lower quality lands. This creates a phenomenon known in the Russian center, particularly as land hunger. The peasants are desperate for more land. Again, something to remember when it comes to the revolution. The peasants are increasingly seeking more land to support bigger families. One solution, or at least temporary solution to this, is to migrate. After all, you don't need the landowner's permission to move anymore. And as we're going to discuss in a second, or I think a second, possibly tomorrow, it's now far easier to travel in Russia, to leave the world of your village behind and go elsewhere. Many men make use of the lull in the agriculture calendar in the winter to go to the new cities, places like Petersburg, Moscow, Nizhny Novgorod, etc., etc., to go and earn money in factories, to go and produce, make a salary, and then send that money back to the villages. Now, this has two major consequences. One is that the village economy is now becoming monetarized. Increasingly, peasants are having a cash income. And this monetarization is changing the face of the economy of Russia overall. The state, for the first time, imposes cash taxes toward the end of the 19th century, bringing more money into the Russian treasury. Russia's economy is entering modernity. Another thing it changes, of course, is while the man is away, the woman is able to take on or has to take on, in some cases, some of his roles. Of course, her legal status doesn't change, as I hope to discuss in a while or tomorrow. But she is starting to assume roles of head of the household, commander of the household, increasingly in peasant communities. Okay, I think it's 8 o'clock, so I think I've kept you for tonight long enough. Are there any questions about what I've discussed so far?
What was the name of the Bulgakov?
In English, it's the Notes of a Country Doctor. Okay, then we will. I think the best option then is tomorrow we'll try and spend about half an hour getting through 1900 before moving on to Peter the Great. Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow morning, fresh and early at 10 o'clock. Okay.